Today we're going to talk about 3 of the biggest losses in the history of investing in the stock market. And why are we doing this? Well, it's because we're all about risk management at Fallible. We know, like I say in every video, that protecting your downside is how you become successful in the stock market long term. It's not just about one trade or one good year. It's can you repeat your success year after year to really compound and build your wealth. And the only way to do that is if you're protecting your downside. And I know this message sounds crazy in an environment right now where everybody is pumping everything. Every crypto, every stock, every SPAC, everything getting pumped to the moon. So yeah, no one wants to look at their downside, but guess what? Environments like this don't last forever. And even in an environment like this, and any other environment, always risk management comes first. So we try to make videos to remind people of real investing because it is absolutely so easy to get caught up in all the mania. So the examples that we're going to go over in this video are going to show you how bad it can get when you don't manage risk. And really, it's much cheaper to learn from other people's mistakes than having to make those mistakes yourself. Because every time you make a mistake in the stock market, guess what? It's going to cost you money. We call that market tuition. But we much rather learn from someone who's already made all the mistakes. Another nice thing about this video is if you've taken a loss recently, the size of these guys' losses and how bad they screwed up, it's really going to put your loss in perspective. It will make you feel better. And it really goes to show that even professionals blow up huge. And really, I should say professionals, because the real best of the best never blow up like this. So I guess we could say people who somehow have access to large amounts of money are able to lose it just like that. That's at least one thing we have in common with the billionaires. But anyway, these stories are all coming from my buddy Steve's website, New Trader U. He's a great guy and publishes a lot of great articles. So the first big loser that we want to talk about is Adolf Merkel. Here he is right here. He's a German billionaire, or he was a German billionaire. So Merkel here was actually the 94th richest person in 2008, according to Forbes. He had a huge business conglomerate. They owned so many companies and had 100,000 employees. So this is a big time guy. But his entire empire was about to come crashing down because he made a bunch of bad bets on VW. So at the time, a bunch of hedge funds were short VW. They thought it was going to go bankrupt. And Victor happened to be one of these guys. But sure enough, there was a short squeeze that happened, which briefly made VW the world's most valuable company. And by the way, this is all happening in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So it's really, really bad times right now. So the share price rocketed to over 1,000 euros from 210 in just 2 days. Crazy, nearly 5x movement right there. And it happened because their rival Porsche made a surprise stakeholding announcement. They said, hey, turns out we got a lot into this company. And that screwed over everyone trying to short VW. So Merkel ended up taking a huge loss of $539 million because of that short position. And then he basically had to crawl to the banks to try and get bridge loans because he was so screwed. His whole business was getting hit by this trade. And this caused a lot of controversy in Germany because he's a billionaire going to the banks and even the government to ask for help to bail him out. And you know, everyone hates bailouts. So they started calling him in the newspapers the billionaire with empty pockets. Will Merkel, the gambler of billions, be saved by the state? So they were really hammering him. And unfortunately, what he ended up doing with all this pressure and all this terrible stuff going on is take his own life. He actually jumped in front of a train. It's very sad. His family issued a statement. They said the desperate situation of his companies caused by the financial crisis, the uncertainties of the last few weeks, and his powerlessness to act have broken the passionate family entrepreneur, and he took his own life. So like I said, remember, this is during the 2008-2009 period, which was horrible. Now this right here is a worst case scenario, but sadly this is how bad investing can get. He's not the first person to take his own life because of it, and he's not going to be the last, which is why we talk about this stuff. When we say it's extremely important, it really is extremely important, because whether we like it or not, we are attached to money. If you don't have money, you're in trouble, which is why I could drive people to something as extreme of what Adolf did. Now there's a few lessons we can learn from this. One is don't put yourself in position where you're making a bet that you cannot lose, because when you go into the stock market, you always got to realize there is going to be risk. You can always lose everything. So in Merkel's case, losing out on this trade was causing a domino effect in the rest of his company, where he had creditors and banks after him because he couldn't make payments because of the trade. And all of that came together to create the worst situation possible for him. And then you saw how it ended up. So big losses can have cascading effects. They affect everything. Even for you and me, say we take a huge loss in the stock market, all of a sudden we can't pay our bills, we can't afford our mortgage. That's possible to happen, right? But the way you prevent it is to never invest that much in the first place. Because if you take a loss and you can't pay your rent, you shouldn't have been investing that money. Don't create a fragile system for yourself where taking one loss is going to ruin everything. Don't bet what you can't lose. You always got to remember that. People tend to forget about the actual risk in the stock market, but it's always there. The second lesson we could learn from him is why it gets so bad. It's not just losing the money, but it's all this shame that comes with it too. See, Merkel here had a reputation for being very prudent and very cautious. An entrepreneur entrepreneur who was always down to earth. So when he lost this money, it was a huge surprise to everyone. And on top of that, because he was looking to go to the government, he started getting everyone against him. They're calling him the billionaire with empty pockets. So he lived his entire life building this whole company, and he had a certain self-image that was absolutely crushed by this loss. His reputation was shattered, at least in his eyes. And yeah, this is a big time guy. If you or me take a loss, we're not going to end up in the papers, unless it really is some majestically huge loss. But we still suffer from those same emotions because we're all humans, we're all wired to be in tribes. So a lot of times it's not just you taking the loss and losing the money, but then you start thinking, what is my wife or husband going to say? What's my family going to say? My friends? Did I let my kids down? Because now their college plans are pushed back. Everything gets tied into money, whether we like it or not. And that's why you got to treat it seriously, and you always got to manage your risk. And I was talking about the domino effect before, right? Like one thing collapsing, ruining everything else. Well, your relationships, your mental health, that's part of everything else. It's extremely tough emotionally, not just the money loss, but everything that comes with it. Now, the next loss we're going to talk about is from these two guys, the Hunt brothers. And these guys, what they try to do is corner the silver market. So what does cornering the market mean? It means that you've collected so much of a particular asset, say like silver, that you could basically manipulate the price however you want. It's always a dream that someone goes after every few years, a trader who thinks too much of himself, as you'll see soon. So the Hunt brothers were trying to corner the market in silver for a long time, and they did succeed somewhat. The price of silver jumped from $6.08 in 1979 to $49.45 in 1980. That's an increase of 713%. So those two brothers were estimated to hold 1/3 of the entire world's supply of silver. And it got really bad for anyone else who was trying to purchase silver because it was so expensive. So Tiffany's, the jewelry maker, they took out a full page in the New York Times where they condemned the Hunt brothers. They said it's wrong for anyone to hoard several billion, yes, $1 billion worth of silver, and thus drive the price up so high that others must pay artificially high prices for articles made of silver. Basically saying they shouldn't corner this market because they push prices so high that no one else can afford silver anymore. But in response to their accumulation and their cornering, the exchange rules regarding the leverage they were using were changed. So COMEX adopted the Silver Rule 7, which placed heavy restrictions on purchases of commodities on margin. And the Hunt brothers had borrowed heavily to be able to finance their purchases. So as soon as silver prices began to fall, and they dropped over 50% in just 4 days actually, they were unable to meet their obligation, which turned into a big problem for everyone, as you'll see in a second here. So the price of silver ended up dropping below their minimum margin requirement, and they got a margin call for $100 million. But they weren't able to even meet that margin call. And when you get a margin call, you got to pay that to your brokerage right away. And on top of that, these brothers were facing a potential loss of $1.7 billion. And by the way, this is all in the 80s. So these are big numbers by today's standards, but in the 80s, they were even bigger. And these numbers were so big that they caused some systemic risk in the market. Many government officials feared that if the Hunts were unable to meet their debts, large Wall Street brokerage firms and banks might collapse. So we're once again getting to that situation of too big to fail because all these things are tied together so tightly, especially when you got these gamblers swinging huge amounts of money, like these Hunt brothers trying to corner the silver market. So to save the situation, a bunch of banks ended up providing a $1.1 billion line of credit to these brothers, which allowed them to pay off their brokerage. But then the SEC got involved because it turns out the Hunt brothers actually owned 6.5% of that brokerage bank that they were paying back. So you had a bit of double dipping collusion going on. So through this whole ordeal, the Hunts lost over $1 billion, but they were still rich. Their estimated net wealth declined from $5 billion in 1980 to less than $1 billion in 1988. But again, still a lot. So, and they were found responsible of trying to corner the market in silver, which is illegal. So they had to pay a fine of $134 million because they had to compensate a mineral company that had lost money because of what they did. But a lot of people lost money because of it. And the brothers even had to declare bankruptcy, which was one of the biggest filings in Texas history. So yeah, in a way they got off real easy, just had to pay a fine when we're talking legally, but at least their fortunes got really screwed up after all the BS that they pulled. Few lessons here that we can learn. Lesson number one, don't think you're smarter than the stock market. We talk about this all the time, but these Hunt brothers are a perfect example of it. And every trader who tries to corner markets, the only time you're trying to corner a market is when you really think too much of yourself, that you're bigger than the market, that you can control it, which you can't. It's stupid to think that, and you're just being overconfident and cocky. It's hubris. And another thing to remember is that the exchange actually changed the rules on them. That's one of the things that screwed them up. And that's what you got to watch out for in the stock market, because they will change the rules on you. So you got to not only protect your downside with the current rules, but any potential changes that could come through as well, which is why you would probably stay away from extremely risky things like trying to corner the market with a bunch of leverage, which is exactly what these guys did. Lesson number two that we need to learn from this is that the system will not protect you. The thing is, every bank and everyone in this whole financial system, they're just out for profits themselves. So in this Hunt brothers situation, why were they allowed to get so much leverage and so much money in the first place? The banks that approved it, I mean, they could probably clearly see what they were trying to do and how it would probably end. But if they can get their own profit out of it, then why not? Same thing that happened in 2008. Should banks have been giving loans to all these people with no jobs so that they could buy these houses that they'll never be able to afford? Of course not. But if they stand to make a buck out of it, then they're going to do whatever and they don't care until someone stops them, like the government. But the government is always 10 steps behind. The recent Archegos fund collapse with Bill Hwang. Why did they let him do what he did? Again, just to make a buck, even though he shouldn't have had that much leverage. So you got to remember, the banks, the brokerages, they do not care. They're not going to put any guardrails on you as long as you're paying them. They will even help you break the law. Their incentive is always just money in their pocket. So don't ever rely on the system to stop you from doing something or protect you. It won't. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about is Robert Citron right here. Now, this guy was actually the treasurer tax collector in Orange County, California, and this is mid-90s right now. So he was in charge of this county's finances, all of them, which is a lot of money, like $8 billion. See, he managed funds that were worth around $8 billion. And through a series of highly levered deals that included repo agreements and floating rate notes, Citron here was able to at one point achieve leverage of 292%. And this is Orange County right here. Should they really be on leverage at all? He's dealing with like pensions and things like that. And the whole thing would collapse if interest rates went up. His whole plan here, his whole investment system, we can't even call it a system, because most of the collateral that he had was US Treasury bonds. So if interest rates went up, he'd be screwed. Well, guess what? Interest rates went up and Orange County lost a boatload of money. So the Fed rose interest rates and that caused many of the securities in Orange County's investment pools to fall. So of course, there was margin calls happening. They were asking for more margin from them. And Orange County was actually able to give that margin by issuing some bonds worth over $600 million, but that only worked for a small period of time. Eventually, Credit Suisse figured out what was going on and blocked the rollover of $1.25 billion in repos. And Orange County couldn't do anything at that point and had to file for bankruptcy because of the deals that this Robert Citron made and the stupid amount of leverage that he put on that county. So what are the lessons here? First, the whole leverage thing and the complex instruments that he was using. Well, guess what? Just because you know the definition of a certain instrument doesn't mean you actually know how it works and all the things that it can do and all the things that can go wrong. You don't fully understand it just because you know the definition. So this guy is a treasurer tax collector, not a hedge fund genius, but he's playing with highly levered deals that include repo agreements and floating rate notes. Something complex he doesn't understand. He doesn't know the risk. And that's the biggest thing. When I'm saying you don't understand something, I mean you don't understand the downside. Because how could you when you get so complex? Lots of people do it with options because we're not at that county level scale with the county money to play with. But just because you know what an iron condor is does not mean that you know options. My partner in macro ops, Tyler, when he first taught me all he knows about options and he's an actual options pro, I was like, what? This is completely different from how all of us were trading. When you start looking at them in terms of implied volatility and all the things that you're supposed to look at and how you're supposed to use the instrument, way different than what everyone is doing, which is why only few people actually make money in options, and it's the professionals. And it's the same thing. It's the false sense of confidence when you're like, oh, I know what a butterfly is. It's like, who cares? You still don't actually understand it, and you don't understand the risk or how to actually use it. And that seems to be what happened with Robert here. So when you're investing, don't play with those instruments unless you have a ton of experience, unless you truly understand every aspect of them. And if you do get into them, start small, then get bigger. Too many people get excited by complicated things. Really, in the stock market, I would say just keep it simple. Keep it as simple as possible, what you can understand. That way you could understand the risk, and you can still make tons of money with just a simple system. Don't get that shiny object syndrome where you get real excited by complex stuff. The more complex you get, the more dangerous it usually gets too, and the more risk there is, especially because you understand less. Now, if you want to avoid losses like the ones that these guys are taking, then watch this video right here. We talk about the most important thing you need to do to make sure you never end up in one of these articles about the worst losses ever. Click this link right here and I will see you in that video.